So hello again, you're listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast, and for today's interview, I have Creston Davis, who is the founder of the Global Center for Advanced Studies. So hey Creston, how are you doing?
Hey, doing well, thanks. It's nice to be on here. Thanks.
So Creston, the Global Center for Advanced Studies, or GCAS, was something I found really interesting because it has a pretty interesting model in that it's based on a cooperative model, and it actually uses an Ethereum-based token, I believe, to give ownership shares into the university and is used to buy other university-related things. So it's really interesting. It's pretty new, but I think you guys have already had quite a little bit of success with having some pretty big names like Noam Chomsky, I know Chris Hedges, some pretty big academics come and speak for GCAS in different seminars. But so I'm curious, what is the origin story of GCAS, and what was the motivation behind creating such an institution?
Well, thanks for your question, and it's really a pleasure to be on the Socialist Blockchain. I think it's really important, if I might just add as a prefatory comment, it's really important, I think, that folks who are for the commons really claims technologies towards building the commons. So thank you. But in terms of your question, I mean, it's a really long answer, but I'll try to keep it, manageable. I mean, I guess the first time we thought through this, or it came to my mind, was in 2002 when Slavoj Zizek asked about where is the Frankfurt School today. We were having a conversation over a conference that I had organized called Ontologies in Practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so he asked, where's the Frankfurt School for today? And it sort of got me thinking, sort of cranking the gears in my mind about what would it look like in the 21st century. So with that in mind, and collecting conversations around, drinking alcohol at conferences with friends, and you just sort of wax romantic about a potential for developing an institute. And so my friend Clayton Crockett and Jeff Robbins was in on that early, but eventually you end up getting your PhD and taking that tenure track job. I had two little boys, and the pressure of keeping a family going while I was pursuing my PhD. And then finally you get that tenure track offer. And so it was sort of tabled for a while. But being a professor at a liberal arts college, a pretty decent one in Florida called Rollins College, for me, just seeing your students graduate, and you really want them to succeed, but then you start to get feedback, and not just a little feedback, trickle feedback. You get, kind of droves of feedback where really good students who are amazing thinkers and have amazing gifts can't get employed at levels that are commensurate with their education. So I started digging into what are the kind of the mode of productions that sort of undergird and give rise to the contemporary university and college in the United States. And once you start digging into that kind of mode of production, looking at the old deep throat question, the old deep throat from All the President's Men, if you remember the famous line, follow the money, right? So you start to follow that money, and you start to realize that since Reagan came to power as the president, he really shifted how higher education functions. Kind of using the political platform of cutting massive taxes to the commons, to state-funded institutions or the humanities, the arts, and of course education. And what he did was he signed into law, I think it was 1982, I might be wrong on that, but he signed into law basically saying that education is an entrepreneurial exercise, or it's an entrepreneurial engagement, that If you are going to go off to uni and get a degree, well, that's a risk. And ultimately, that risk falls on the individual as opposed to the collective, the state, or the community, or the nation. And so when you start to atomize the risk factor to the individual, you start to see what you have is a massive increase of tuition going up, massively going up. And this is because state funds are cut, federal funds are cut, at 70% since the 80s. And so how are colleges and universities going to survive? They're going to survive by raising that tuition level. And of course, most individuals can't afford, massive tuition increases. So what does the government do? It steps in kind of like a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme of sorts, and says, oh, don't worry, just sign on this piece of paper and we'll give you the guaranteed funds so that you can get your education. Isn't that great? Well, it's, to an 18-year-old, signing a loan is kind of like, who cares? You're 18. And there's a very deceptive motivation behind it, right? And you don't really perceive the risks and the economic harm on signing that paper. Furthermore, because colleges and universities are competing amongst themselves, you start getting luxurious kinds of infrastructure on universities. You get away from the library as a real research, investment, and books and articles and so on. And you get more of gyms. Sports becomes much more corporatized with the NCAA, the rise of the NCAA through the 80s and 90s. And then you eventually end up with absurd kinds of things happening on campus, including like lazy rivers. And so now it becomes for the student a kind of hedonistic environment in which you party. And the emphasis is moved. So now you can start to see from the Reagan shift of cutting massive funding to universities, how that ultimately leads down the road to the lazy river, if you will, and creates an environment of Animal House, the kind of hedonistic party. Who cares? I'm going into massive debt. Let's party hard. And as a result, academics really goes by the wayside. Not only that, but when you're in a classroom and you're going into debt, you need to see an economic outcome of reading something like Homer or reading, Shakespeare or understanding sophisticated philosophical or economic, arguments. And as a result, you end up by kind of the apparatus itself undercutting the humanities, undercutting critical thinking, and shifting everything towards more STEM or science-based education or business-based education. So now what you've effectively done is you've gutted the university, which was designed, the modern university emerged in the late 18th, early 19th century, in which it basically emerged on the scene with advanced industrial capitalism or early stages of capitalism, industrial capitalism. And as a result, the university was really set up to hold into check these corporate powers. I mean, Jefferson was very clear when he founded the University of Virginia, of which I had the privilege of attending. But Jefferson was very clear, as were others who founded universities in the early 19th century. Look, the university is there to train minds so that we can be critical of corrupt power, including corrupt corporate power. There was a real fear of the New York, Wall Street, Federalist, Hamiltonian position in early America. There was a fear, and that's one of the reasons why they ended up moving the capital of the United States away from literally on Wall Street. In fact, the first capital of the United States was built literally by the wall that was called Wall Street. There was literally a wall that surrounded the corporation, because keep in mind, in 1624 or 25, when New York was founded, it was founded by the West Indies Corporation. It was a corporation. And so when you have the capital of an early country, built out of the wall from the Wall Street, the street on which the wall was, then you end up having a collusion. Now, that collusion still exists today. Wall Street and politicians, we know what that is. So stepping back and sort of summarizing how all this came into being, as I looked into the mode of production, I didn't realize just how corrupt and what a scam higher education really is. If you think about it, Harvard University, a couple years ago, there was an article put out, I think in 2011, in which it basically stated, made very clear that the top 4 hedge fund managers of Harvard's massive endowment, which I think now is pushing $40 billion, made more money than almost the entire faculty combined. So what do you end up having? You don't have universities that are concerned with critical thinking and developing a rich dialogue within the citizenry so as to create more progressive, more advanced ways in which human beings can get along with each other. No, you have just the opposite. You have that gutting of critical thinking to the point where you can have a popularist like a Donald Trump rise to power, and 40% of the populace buys into patently false claims that can be easily disproven, but you end up having an uneducated populace voting in a president by 4 years ago, very narrowly. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote. And so you end up having a destruction of society as a whole. And all this is built in and part and parcel of how the neoliberal university, let's call it that, since the Reagan era, emerged and functions and recapitulates itself over and over again, putting more and more people into harm's way. And you hear these things in the universities where, come to our university, we teach the whole person. Well, it turns out you end up, maybe you teach, but you don't teach the whole person. You don't give a damn about the harm you're doing economically to that person. And why? Because it's disguised in terms of 18-year-olds taking advantage of 18-year-olds to sign loans, to party hard for 4 years, and not be able to get a job afterwards. So you can see the whole thing is set up. And it's more complicated than this, but these are just sort of the general strokes. And as a result, I was thinking through that, and I was like, is it possible, given advanced technologies that we have, like online learning, which I loathe in many ways, but can you do it? Like, is it possible to put together resources in a way that's strong enough and can start to reproduce themselves? Like Althusser asked the question in his 69 essay, The Ideological State Apparatus, how does capitalism reproduce itself? And with that question, I was thinking, well, how can we set up a mode of production that's built into education that can reproduce itself in a way that resists the corporate neoliberal position? And so we tweaked the model. It took a couple years, but even after the first year in 2013, when I founded GCAS in Colorado originally, 6-8 months later, we're having buyout offers from firms, and it's like it's not even for sale. They don't even understand. It's almost like you're speaking a different language when you're starting up something like this. And the beauty of it isn't in the bottom line of like, we're 10x, we're startup 10x, or we're making funds hand over fist. Rather, the beauty is, what does that collectivity that you're creating do consciously? So it's a question of like what Luke Koch was asking in the history of class consciousness. It's the question of how do you create a consciousness that understands the world differently than centralization, than capitalism, pure capitalism in terms of profit making? And can you sustain a business model that's outside or thinks differently from that? So that's sort of gives you the background. I'm sorry, I tried to manage it.
It's my fault. I asked the question, but no, I think I agree with that. It seems to me that when we think of neoliberalism now, we sort of are purely thinking of it maybe in like the in the economy and like in relation to corporations, but I think it could maybe be argued that one of the biggest influences, or one of the places that neoliberalism tried to influence in the beginning was universities, and was like this shift of essentially taking these public institutions and making them profit oriented, and in a way almost like meta profit oriented, in the sense that we need to prioritize those studies that create people who will make a lot of money, and that is, the end all be all. But yeah, I remember when I was when I was thinking about applying to university in the US, like you get these letters about, they say absolutely nothing on them, but they're so like, they try to be like inspirational and very like individualized, and like you're going to become the best person you'll ever become, when in reality, I mean, you're thinking about how fun are the parties when you get there, because that's how you justify the cost. I think in reality is, by most part, is like how much fun you're going to have at the end of the day when you're 18 and you're thinking about that.
Yeah, it's an amusement park,
That's what you're thinking about.
Yeah, exactly. And, as a professor, I mean, for me, when I was an undergrad, it was a question of like, I want to study. After I came out of the Army, I had saved up $15,000 in the early 90s, mid 90s. And I was like so focused on learning that it didn't occur to me. But as a professor, you start to see this kind of decadence and this opulence that surrounds what it means to be a student. And, and like you were saying about neoliberalism, I mean, it started with, the first case study was really Chile as a country, in which the Chicago boys, including Milton Friedman and Kayak. What's his name?
Hayek,
that's it. Hayek. It's Austrian. And, those they trained pretty wealthy upper middle class students that came from Chile up to the University of Chicago, because let's face it, you have to be wealthy to make that track. And ultimately, they were there and designed to undercut public assets. And this, of course, gave rise to the junta, or the military dictator Pinochet, and the CIA-backed coup in 1973, September 73. But what thing's really cool was when we established, and it was actually almost 3 years ago to the day, that we established a GCAS center in Chile. And it was kind of like poetic justice. Like, you can destroy a country and market out the water and privatize the electrical grid and so on. But, there's still resistance. And it's not just resisting the trend of neoliberalism. It's actually producing something positive. Because it's one thing to be defensive, but eventually your defenses wear down. And unless you have a strategy of internally, keeping going and sustaining one's own organization, you're going to eventually wear down, burn out, and wither away. So it was really poetic when I was down there in 2017, and we established GCAS Chile, which has now become GCAS Latin America and associated with Mexico City and Peru. And it's pretty amazing how that started. There's a lot of energy in the global South for a collectivity. And in part, I think maybe it's because of its Catholic background, but also its indigenous ethos that binds communities together.
Coming off of that, for GCAS, what are the current options for studying at the school?
Yeah, so there's two basic approaches or options. One is anyone from the public can take courses with us in our e-school, which is available. You can subscribe for $10 or €10 a month and take all the courses you want with these leading philosophers and theorists, and connect up with our community of researchers. We call students researchers because we're all searching together. And so that's the first option, is the e-school. The other option is enrollment and matriculation into degree programs. So we are, in fact, the first that we know of. Well, we are the first historic college that grants degrees that is co-owned by faculty, graduates, and some supporters on blockchain. And so and using our crypto token. So it is really exciting. I originally thought of the whole blockchain possibility, I don't know, maybe it was 5 years ago in 2015, 2016, when I was in Slovenia as a dean or a vice dean there, starting up a master's and PhD program for an accredited university in Europe. And while I was doing that, I was thinking, gosh, unless you're a millionaire, you're never going to start a college. Unless you have millions and millions of dollars, there's no way you can start it. And if you have millions, think about this. If anybody who has that kind of resource, you're not going to be thinking about how can we create a debt-free culture and a co-owned culture. You're going to be thinking, how am I going to return on this $10 million dollars that I have, or euros? How am I going to make a return and keep afloat? That's your thinking. And as a result, you don't get projects that are like a commons project that is really serious about rigorous education at a level that's even more quality than high R1 institutions. I attended Oxford for a bit. I went to Duke, did my master's, went off to Yale, and started my postgraduate studies there, and ended up finishing at University of Virginia. So I've been to really elite, so-called elite universities, and I can tell you this: that the way we've designed our pedagogy in terms of what students can expect is far better, even online, because you're connecting. You have to have a mentor or a supervisor, academic supervisor, with whom you are in constant contact. And, you have to be very serious. So when folks look at what we're doing, they think, wow, that's amazing. And then they throw in an application. But if they're not serious and they're not really good researchers that has all the toolkit that you need to be a good researcher, you just don't make it. Because we are creating and we are developing very, front cutting edge leading researchers that are doing things like, for example, one of our students did her master's at the London School of Economics, and she's thinking through a dissertation on human trafficking in relationship to global warming. There's a connection. Now, that's a hard connection to make ethnographically. What are the evidence bases, what's the methodology, and so on. But she's doing that kind of research, and it's incredible. And these are the kinds of researchers that we're developing and nurturing. So there are two ways: e-school, anybody can take, and then you can matriculate. It's difficult to get accepted, and we only accept folks that we believe are going to be co-owners when they graduate, and therefore decision makers in our community and how we move forward. So we're very particular about who comes in.
I guess it'll probably vary a tiny bit if you're going to the e-school, if you're going into full matriculation. But then what does the life of a student at a school like this, which I think is for the most part online, I mean, probably most universities are online at the moment, but this is made to be online. How does that look like as a student?
Yeah, I mean, we actually do blended learning where we have, at times before COVID, we would have, in-person seminars in Havana, Cuba, New York, where Oliver Stone, and Chris Hedges taught for us directly, Richard Wolff. Slovenia, Athens, we had several thousand people at our conference in Athens and our summer institute there. So we do a hybrid where you can teach together, and students or researchers in GCAS who are close by can show up. So that way they're not burning a lot of CO2 and fossil fuels to show up. And anybody else who can't afford it or don't want to burn fossil fuels to show up can do that online. So actually, it is a blended style. We do have a place in Dublin where we're building out after COVID where we'll be holding classes there more on a permanent basis. But we also want to think about the Earth. What's the best for the Earth, and how can we become zero carbon emissions university or college, and how can we stimulate a culture behind that, but without also losing people in the Zoom sphere, right? Because that's also, I think, alienating. But it does work, and I think people are kind of adjusting to that.
I feel like it's become a bit more normalized having Zoom calls with your friends and people. It's less stiff maybe than before.
Yeah, I think so. But I always knew that this was going to take off. The online learning was going to take off, and it was only going to take off because profit margins are much higher, 30% higher, when you can get rid of overhead costs like maintaining liability costs of buildings. And so it's going to go that way. And ultimately, the bubble that is the higher education neoliberal structure is going to bust. I think that's inevitable. And so it's really important to bring, to create this kind of structure where you don't need overhead costs, and therefore you can pass the costs on and alleviate the student from going into debt. And yet at the same time, you can pay your faculty, decent enough wages that is competitive, and you stimulate quality that way too. So it is working. Of course, there's always adjustments and tweaks that we're constantly making, and there are challenges for sure. But, we also work with farms and all that, which we can get into a little bit in terms of how our token functions as well.
Yeah, sure. What I wanted to ask next is about the GCAS Crypto Hub, which is a pretty interesting thing. It's I guess I should let you talk about it. What is the GCAS Crypto Hub, and how does that relate to the cryptocurrency token that you guys have?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Thanks for asking. It's GCAS.io. GCAS is GCAS, Global Center for Advanced Studies, .io. And it's a landing page where if originally anybody could come on and earn tokens. And that was exciting. But there were some issues, and we needed to clear up some of those issues where we had trolls functioning at a pretty high level. We've had alt-right come in and troll us as well. So what we had to do is we had to close it down so that only folks who are matriculated, or what we call in our core community or members, can participate in our currency exchange or the crypto hub. And it's a site where you can cash in tokens that you've earned for classes. You can earn tokens and claim tokens through the bounty sheet, so you can do certain tasks and earn tokens. If you do really well on a research paper, you can earn tokens. If you publish a book, for example, one of our faculty members, Braha Edinger, just published a book, and she's the distinguished faculty for GCAS, and so she gets tokens. Around, it's not a security, but it's the way we look at it is it's roughly 100 tokens to 10 euros, something along those lines. And students we have one student who's earned enough tokens to get themselves more than halfway through their PhD without fiat. And when I say fiat, as I'm sure your audience knows, that's dollars or euros. So it's quite amazing to see an economy work like this. Now, we only have like 400 people in the economy itself. Okay, and out of those 400 people, around 50 or 60 are really active. That is, they're trading, they're exchanging, they're earning, and so on. And when you graduate from GCAS, you can also cash in your tokens for more shares. So it's an asset. We recognize the asset. However, we have it very clear. It's not a security. It's not money. It's rather our way to recognize work and track work accurately, put it on the block. You can claim it. We go through a crypto committee, and if somebody's claimed so many tokens, we look at the work that they've done and award the tokens. We haven't had an issue like that. I think we've issued maybe 250,000 tokens so far. And and people can exchange them, pay down tuition. They could trade them for. We're not quite at the store level yet, where we can sell books through our tokens. We're getting close. We were close to working with Fairmundo in Germany, where we had an MOU. We didn't quite finish the MOU, but essentially, others can recognize our tokens in exchange for goods and services or products. And we're getting there. We're slowly moving in that direction. And so it's really exciting to think of you exchange ideas, and you earn tokens. And so what you end up having is a recreation of a consciousness where your understanding of how you think and exchange ideas with others and create your own methodologies and scientific developments. And that turns into a fluid way to exchange and create a mode of production that can reproduce itself. Okay, does it purely reproduce itself? Not exactly yet, but keep in mind, even Karl Marx, I think it was in volume 3 of Das Kapital, he talks about the transition from capitalism to communism using tokens. Okay, so there was a moment there that Marx identified, and I think we are. If you step back and you look at Bitcoin, you look at tokens, something is happening clearly. I mean, Bitcoin just, their cap is at an all-time high at 18,000 recently. And something's happening whereby the centralized structures of the control fiat, the control dollars and euros and pounds, are starting to have a rivaling, value structure. And what we're trying to do is accelerate that value structure in terms of how we get along with each other, respect each other, how we publish, how we define scientific research. And that creates a whole different level of how you think, okay, together in a collective. And the dynamic is very different than, I'm an individual and I'm going to party my ass off and have a lot of loans and not get a job. Our dynamic is very different. My success as an individual is only contingent upon the success of others who are in my cohort, who are my research partners and collaborators. And that's where the beauty of what the human can be when it's more than just itself starts to get traction. And that to me, there's nothing more like it. I once put a Twitter up, and it said something like, moving towards a blockchain consciousness. And of course, one of the head blockchain people, a German guy who was like a blue whale or whale of some kind, immediately tagged it and made fun of it. Okay, but there's real truth to understand, and that tells you the limitations of somebody who just thinks in terms of a libertarian, it's me, myself, and I, versus the world. A consciousness develops when you're working together in a mode of production. You're surrounded by a context that others are working with ideas that are pushing the limits of the academic enterprise and creating together. You're out there in interstellar space, you feel like, and you're creating this. Like, okay, Elon Musk might want to go to Mars, but in a way, we're already creating a different kind of world insofar as our consciousness is shifting towards a common good where we're all benefiting at the end of the day. And in the process, that benefits us as well. So it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that it's an example of how the technology, this particular use of the technology goes against this hyper individualized type of view on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. I mean, the very common sort of critique is that it is hyper individualized and it reflects libertarian ideology, and to a certain extent I think that's true, but that isn't the only truth to it, I think. And something like this proves that there is probably an alternative to its use that is more community minded and is more maybe socialistic. You could even argue maybe, but so it's a very cool example for that.
And it is working for people. You tell people what you're doing and they don't believe it, right? They just they think your head's in the sand or on cloud nine. And when you show investors actually what we're doing on paper financially, they're taken aback by the possibilities that have emerged. Indeed, just last year around this time, I was in Helsinki talking to a fintech investor, a pretty well-known investor there, and he committed to investing. And so because he knew that education, the future of education, if you can tokenize it in some way, then that ultimately is going to win the gambit. However, when you think about education as tokenization, sometimes that can be very dangerous, right? Like, I'm only doing this to earn tokens. Like, I'm only going to read that extra footnote, because I'm going to get an extra 10 tokens or something like that. And, to alleviate that possibility from happening, I mean, we don't line up in competitive you versus me ways of earning tokens. It's a collective, collaborative. So we do small group work, and that small group accomplishes a task. My dream is to do something like have undergrads solve problems like the Flint, so lead in the water or the contaminated water in the city of Flint, Michigan. Like, imagine having 100 GCAS researchers doing their bachelor's degree, working with engineers to solve that problem in 3 years before they graduate. It's those kinds of projects that I really want to get off the ground.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. If you want to be sure that more content like this can be created, you can donate to my efforts through Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist, you can start donating at $3 per month and help me out, and join the newest patron, Christopher, and the 15 other existing patrons. So at the moment, I've spent more on the project than I've ever earned from it due to hosting costs, so any amount is always really helpful. I'm also planning on releasing more Patreon exclusive content, so be sure to keep an eye out. And of course, I will always be making free content like this interview about GCAS to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. If you can't help out financially, no worries. You can always subscribe to the podcast and leave a positive review on whatever your preferred platform is, including iTunes, Spotify, Podcast Addict, YouTube, etc. And share it with anyone that you think would be interested in the topic. But that's it for me. Let's get back to the interview. Now, it'll be very cool to see what happens with it. I'm curious what the feedback has been maybe from other some of the famous lectures and academics that you have as part of GCAS. Like, what has been their response to this type of idea? I mean, I think the university as a cooperative is something that would probably be very enticing to maybe particular academics because of, I'm sure academics have a lot of frustrations with the current traditional academic model, particularly in the US. And this provides an alternative, but then also the added addition of this cryptocurrency token. I imagine for an academic who's maybe, they're really into social sciences, they don't know much about technology, and the most that they know about cryptocurrency is about Bitcoin, and that it's a libertarian thing, it's very right wing. Like, how do you convince them that there's actually a way to synthesize these things in a positive direction?
It's a great question, in fact, and I'll answer it in two ways. So first, how overwhelmingly the professors in the humanities and social sciences have embraced what we're doing. But there are exceptions, naturally. So that sort of answers your first question. And the second one is, how do you overcome that when you throw your cards on the table? We're gonna do this token, we're gonna do this blockchain cryptocurrency. When you throw those words down on a card table in front of all to see, you definitely have a high education curve to deal with, because that pump and dump schemes, like, here's my token, buy. So, you pay a celebrity $100,000 to wear a t-shirt, and there's a pump, and everybody buys it. Meanwhile, the ones who created it, 3 or 4 people that created it, dump it. And when it's high, and so therefore it's not worth anything. We've seen this time and again, and it's scammy. Bitcoin, it's still, I think Bitcoin is functioning, but we can talk about the architecture later about the Bitcoin in particular, because I think that's another question altogether. So how do you communicate that? Well, that's one of the reasons why we created that Crypto Hub, to educate. Like, what is it? And how can a professor, when they're lecturing somewhere else, or when they publish an article, how do they participate and grow the value of GCAS through that very act of disseminating good research and good teaching? So those are the kinds of things. And, when we connect it up to our shares, when we can have conversions to our shares from our token, then that helps people, because now there's an exit. There's an asset right there, not as the token, but the token can be recognized by owners of GCAS as an asset, rather the token can be. We can recognize as potential assets through the token that are not assets or securities, but we can convert that into such without there being issues with the SEC or any issues like that, because it's just an internal token that we recognize. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't go public, or we pulled back from going public early on. I would love to do more of a public thing, but you have to figure out ways of keeping trolls out or pump and dump schemes from coming in and blowing it up. So we did the conservative route to protect our commons, or more socialized token, and the potential that has in promise. One last thing, just returning back to your first question about how some have reacted to GCAS. Again, overwhelmingly, absolutely in favor of what we're doing. Indeed, when we started GCAS in August 2013, well over 100 leading academics, intellectuals, from Alain Badiou to Slavoj Zizek, and to leading, in fact, Ernesto Laclau. I don't know, are you familiar with Ernesto Laclau? Anyway, he also joined, but he passed away. Umberto Eco, for example, the great Italian writer and hermeneuticist and polymath, would write me emails saying, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful vision. So I knew I was on to something. Yet at the same time, we had a minority, only a handful, but there was 1 or 2 of these folks in the minority that saw us as a threat. And what was weird, and I won't mention names until I publish the book, but what was strange and uncanny about it was they were publishing radical books, incredibly progressive, radical books. But yet, and I talked to some folks that had inside information, these people were the 1%. So on the one hand, they were publishing radical books saying revolution, yeah. On the other side, they were getting massive amounts of money, free apartments from universities, charging $50,000 for a 1-hour lecture. And when we created GCAS, I think they could start to see the future, even in its in its very seed form or germ of GCAS. They could see the threat, and they took exception to that threat, and they went to war. They tried to get us. They pulled strings in ways that were very strange, but in any case, it was kind of gangster actually early on in 2014.
Academic gangsterism.
Yeah. But anyway, we managed to eschew that threat, and we just keep moving on.
So I really would want to know if you ever had the chance to talk to Noam Chomsky about cryptocurrencies.
Oh, actually, he and I talk quite a bit. Not quite a bit. We email on occasion, let's say. I wonder. I haven't actually asked him that. I would be really curious. I think that the concept of cryptocurrency is sort of a younger generation kind of thing, and older minds that have been shaped by fiat. And again, it's consciousness, right? It's the consciousness about fiat and how the world functions in relationship to centralized money sources and power. That to me, like Richard Wolff, for example, won't touch it. But maybe, I think it's the future. It's the way to. It's ultimately, it can be seen as it can be weaponized as a social collective that can really create a lot of space for keeping that space sustainable over time. It's one thing to protest on the streets, Black Lives Matter or whatever. And Alain Badiou and I were having a conversation about this, that it's great to have, those protests in punctiliar ways, but eventually protests flame out. The passions can't be sustained over time. And as a result, what you need is a catalyst, and a catalyst that sees social change 100 years from now. And so when we were putting together the model of GCAS, we always think 100 years ahead, or what would we imagine humanity to be 100 years from now, and start building towards that vision. And cryptocurrency is part of that vision. There's no doubt. Do you think so?
I mean, I would bet on it higher than 50% in 100 years. But I don't know. What do you see in 100 years?
I mean, I think that the ways that we can keep, smart contracts working in objectively encrypted ways that can't be tapped or hacked, or it's extremely difficult more difficult than, say, stealing money out of a bank physically. That's promising to me. And when you look at all the businesses going on blockchain in terms of logistics, distribution logistics, for shipping companies. I mean, this is the future. But all you need is a crackdown from centralized authority, and it's gone. Like if you do have the crackdown, then you have to go underground. You have to go into the dark web to function. And that's another thing. There's a lot of laundering that goes through Bitcoin. And that was something that we thought, one of our students from Iran who actually created Iran's first token, Iran or Iran coin. And Solomon is his name. He's really great. He pays his tuition in Bitcoin. But he earned it. Like, he actually came from a very educated family. But there's sketchy investors. When I was in Cyprus, sketchy people from old Russia, saying, "Hey, I'm going to give you $1 million investment." And I'm just like, okay, that's all I need to do now is just float $1 million from an old robber baron from the Russian era, the Soviet era, and land that in my bank account. Sure, that sounds really pleasant. And so, even investments that for me look even the littlest, they're not like totally legitimated. You just can't take it. You can't play that game, especially with reputations like ours on the line. So, but I do think, I would bet more than 50% that some form of tokenization is going to happen, and more, I think. In education, you might as well just try it out in education. So
to maybe comment on the thing you're talking about, protests and how they tend to, they happen and then a lot of times they fizzle out and nothing happens. I mean, in particular in the US, I mean, we have, we just show up in the streets, we say what we want and what we want to get out of our system, but then we don't really enact any change. And that's not to criticize, I think, movements that are happening at the moment, but it's just like been a trend for the past couple of decades where not much has changed for the better, even with these protests. And I think that's just, we need to look at what type of strategies were taken up and how do we improve them. And, one of the things that I think that we can do, I mean, for one, is to, of course, create type of institutions that can can reproduce itself, social reproduction. But then as well, I think, particularly on the left, we have to acknowledge that if we do want to have our political goals achieved, there is the potential that we'll come into, direct conflict with institutions that already exist and that are in power. And one of the, under capitalism, just how you have power, one of the ways is through capital. And if they just, tell PayPal, hey, cut off Antifa's access to funds or something like that, or tell Black Lives Matter, they're in organization, they're not allowed to access their funds. What is the alternative? And the alternative is cryptocurrency. That's just a matter of fact. That's how our material conditions are at the moment. And it's important to consider then, how do we look into the future where that is potentially one of the only options that you have for access to capital, and how are you going to prepare for it?
You said that very well. I mean, it is follow the money, and one way to cut off any opposition is prevent them from accessing the very means of reproducing themselves. I mean, and that's what the Klaus von, what was his name? The famous war theorist Clausewitz. He said one of the basic axioms of war is to ensure that the enemy cannot continue resisting. And the way you do that is you cut off their resources over time. And eventually it'll collapse. And, you're right to say that. And I should mention that GCAS, we have people from all over the ideological spectrum. And for us, it's not a question of hiding behind a big name, big S socialism or big C capitalism or communism or whatever. For us, it's a question of like, what can we produce ourselves and think through different modes of human interaction that aren't centralized. Let's face it, socialism is a form of centralization, at least in its political formation, right? In its state formation. And that's what makes what you're doing very interesting, because there's at the heart of it, what looks like a contradiction, socialistic blockchain. So how does that function where, socialism is, or communism centralized, a central committee, literally. So how do you yourself, when you're asked about how does socialism relate to blockchain or crypto tokens or currencies, how do you respond to that? And how can it prevent the corruption of centralization?
For me, I think there is this wrong assumption, first off, that capitalism is decentralized in comparison to other modes of production like socialism. I think in reality, capitalism is very centralized in terms of wealth, very centralized at the very top 1% or whatever percentage you want to use. There is a very wealthy amount, there's a very small amount of very wealthy people who have an inordinate amount of power over the rest of people. So I think that's I try to use that sort of crypto libertarian vocabulary to try to explain, I think, a bit of my position. Yeah, and then I tried to explain as well that there are, of course, many different types of socialism, many different ideas in how to implement a type of mode of production. And yeah, I think there are ways in which we can create, a socialistic type of mode of production at the very least, without needing to use particularly centralized institutions. I think as well, I'm sort of iffy on the how you use decentralization and centralization. I think it's very vague how people use it. It at a certain point it sort of means nothing. There are plenty of, can't tell you the amount of corporations that are co-opting blockchain to create whatever particular use case they want, and they're saying we're making this and we're decentralizing it. And it's like, well, what are you decentralizing? And I think that's really the bigger question that should be asked, and that crypto libertarians, the average one, doesn't. They don't go just another level deeper into understanding, these type of
Well,
things.
I mean, don't you think it's clear, and I'm curious what you think about this. I mean, the way we're using our resources in terms of burning fossil fuels, in terms of, this whole mentality of profits at all costs, and ethics has to be reshaped in terms of what's profitable, and this cult of personality where you raise up people like Bill Gates, people that already had a massive leg up in life, but then just use those resources well. But then, this hero, this billionaire heroes, like, oh, they're obviously, smarter, and they're more human than most people. And I think you have very dangerous ways that humans are relating to each other in terms of how we perceive what is of value and how we link that value to wealth, as opposed to nurturing environments where value can be seen in a much more interesting horizontal ways, right? So, I mean, yeah, we need something else besides the mode of production that's killing I think objectively we are slowly killing the earth or the atmosphere, and we're cooking ourselves slowly like a frog in a pot boiling, right? Or that doesn't feel it because they're cold-blooded. And, that seems to me the direction that we're heading. And unless we start to think differently, like how you're starting to conceptualize blockchain in terms of more of a socialization or a socialistic position that's not state-backed. So it's kind of actually an anarcho-socialism, actually. It seems to me your position is, although, who knows? One has to be careful about labeling people like, okay, let me put a Sharpie on your forehead. That's what you are, But it does seem like if you don't have a state backed, then you are thinking through a syndicalism or an anarchism in some way. But it's true. People aren't making what they used to make. When you look at the actual objective facts, not these Trump people who churn out fake realities and hoaxes and so on like that, which is itself really interesting propaganda-wise and post-truth. But when you look at measured wealth, you used to be able to, as a bank teller, buy a house in the 70s. You could as a teacher, one teacher in the household, they could raise a family of 4. And nowadays, you can't even consider doing that. The way unemployment is, measured is very different than how it was measured in the 70s. It's much more way higher unemployment, 18% or over, depends if you measure it in 1970s terms. So we're all being duped here. The idea that we marginalize science, we marginalize experts, and we slowly over time cook the pot, cook the frog in the pot. And unless we wake up and create alternatives that are self-sustainable or imagine them even, then we're headed in a very dark place. And you can start to see that even with the Republicans, how they're functioning around this whole election thing. They won't even capitulate to truth, right? It's interesting to see that. Now imagine with all the money behind them and all the military power behind a regime like that, this refuses to acknowledge reality or science and just starts to put people in cages. And already that's happening, right? You see that on the border, in the southern border. I mean, when these things, torture was all, in the Guantanamo Bay, you had torture, and now that's suddenly legitimated, and then when Snowden comes out, Assange comes out, and, it reveals truth. And what happens to them? So it's not a pretty place. And what I think you need is a kind of psychological muscles that develop a sense of horizontal connectivity, a consciousness that is decentralized, respecting individual nodes, but also seeing that the power that we have is far greater than we can imagine. And I know that sounds like John Lennon singing "Imagine all the people" and all this kind of jazz, right? But there is a power in it. There really is. And if you can just shake off that neoliberal mentality that it's me against the world, or it's fight or flight, and all these psychological problems, all the pharmaceuticals that we're on, that people are on more and more and more. It's not looking really pleasant for humanity in the next bit. And the fires going. I mean, one can keep a big list. I can go on.
That's true.
Sorry, I feel like I'm a preacher or something. I used to be a preacher actually, so maybe I need to.
No, I wanted to add as well a couple of comments. If I can remember them again. And one of them was that I think another type of centralization that we see under capitalism as well is the centralization of one type of value form that we care about, which is, exchange value is the only thing that capitalism acknowledges as being important, unless you apply all these different types of regulations and laws to force companies to put fair trade on their packages or something like that.
Yeah, for a penny, you pay 5 cents more, and the company gets a penny, and it eventually trickles down. It's ridiculous. But you're right, value is limited.
Also, as well, I just wanted to add that part of neoliberalization, I think, has been people considering every choice that they make as if it's like a consumer choice. And I think that includes into the political sphere, where now people have, they've either bought Joe Biden or they bought Donald Trump. And now if they're not going to get the one that they bought, they want a return. They want to go to the manager and they want to get a return, and that's what they got to do. It's like when you individualize everything and make every sort of interaction so market-based, that's the only way that you can really think of anything that's outside of the realm of talking to your friends or your family into just a market relationship. Then it creates all these different types of side effects, of course, that we're seeing, and I think it's probably contributed to this post-truth world that we live in.
And depression, a sense of, a sense that if you're not thinking in those market terms, then either you're a loser and you're going to be homeless, or you end up getting depressed, and if you can afford it, then you're on pharmaceuticals. It just seems like alternatives that we have are super limited. I remember in the 90s when I got out of the Army, there was a sense in which alternative music was coming into the mainstream. And of course it got gobbled up by the mainstream, something that if you watch a group like Pearl Jam struggled with Ticketmaster and all that, they struggled with it, but eventually they folded. Money wins. Unless you can create a culture where you're looking at value in terms of use value as opposed to exchange value. And it's really interesting how Karl Marx, in the beginning of book 1 of Das Kapital, deals with that and talks about once you have exchange value, you start to see people not in terms of what value they have intrinsically as a human being, but rather the kind of value that other people will perceive as valuable who have the money. The M there is the middle term through which everything gets reified and alienated and commodified ultimately. To the point where you internalize that commodification. So it just, we're heading in a direction that for me, I couldn't consciously as a professor be at a college and asked all my students who were taking the class that I was teaching about, liberating oneself, of overcoming one's own demons and using intellectual and logical tools to deploy in a way that can overcome some things, some problematics, and ultimately for emancipation. I couldn't, in my own conscience, ask people to go into massive debt. I had one student $300,000 in debt, right? And they weren't even completed their master's degree yet. And I couldn't rightfully ask people to ethically ask them to sit in the class to learn how to emancipate oneself, while at the same time going into massive debt. It's a contradiction. And, some people can deal with that, and that's fine. I don't put a blanket statement. If you're a professor at the university, getting paid by the neoliberal, profit-making, debt-creating scheme, I don't judge you. But for me, as in terms of my own consciousness or conscientiousness, I couldn't stay there. I had to figure out another way. And GCAS is one of the projects. There's a couple other projects, but GCAS is one of those projects.
So then, looking at an alternative to the sort of market-based model of university at the moment that we sort of have and are becoming more and more into, how do you see the cooperative model for a university like this sustaining itself in the long term? Do you think it's sustainable under capitalism, in which you're almost required to create profits in order to pay for particular things and pay for taxes, maybe even to keep existing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's like you live in the world but not of the world. There's something like that in the Bible or something. You have to end up paying taxes. You have to end up paying for your platforms that you're putting together, paying for quality assurance measures. So there is a sense in which you have to earn funding to keep it going. So that's a reality. But the way I think, if you have the business model set up in a way that has researchers or students contributing tuition funds, after they graduate, we convert that into ownership shares, so they can start to see, at least at the kickoff point, look, they're investing a couple €1,000 a year, but at the end, when they graduate, they're going to have a legitimate asset certificate that will grow as we grow. And so, that's an incentive for our faculty. They get 1/20th of a percentage of their percentage of ownership every year. So by the time they can retire, it's say 60, 55, 60, or 65, whatever, they're going to be able to sell their shares in a way that would afford them, a nice size investment. That's the idea anyway. But you do have to have, strategies. Like one of ours is, people subscribe to our e-school, and so that generates funds. Our tuition funds help keep us going. We have people who are investing, who are my friends or family members who are investing. So early investment is key. But our commitment is we don't go into loans. We don't crawl to a bank with the tail between our legs and go, please, Mr. Banker, please, you remember Pip, the scene with Pip and the banker in the Charles Dickens. What was that? Oh, not David Copperfield, but in Great Expectations, where he could smell the stench of the wealth, right? And in fact, I'm in a place in London now where Charles Dickens' father was put into debt prison. And that's quite interesting. It's just maybe a 10-minute walk from here. But the point is that, we're out of debt, and we're committed to an ethos that doesn't capitulate as much as possible to centralization. And so far it's been working. This April, it'll be 3 years. We've grown amazingly. And I think the model, one can see the GCAS model. We have 50 enrolled students right now, so it's not big, but it's super high quality and it's intentional. But this model could certainly be scaled in a way that could literally subvert higher education as we know it. I think it's important to be able to think globally, but also be able to focus on the small details in rigorous, analytically sharp ways.
No, I enjoy making connections between things that seem to not have any connection, like blockchain and socialism.
Yes, you do. Yeah, that's great.
Creston, I think that's all I have in terms of questions. I don't know if there was anything else you really wanted to mention, or...
No, it's really nice to see your project going. I remember seeing your project on Twitter going, blockchain socialists. Now that's cool. But then I immediately thought, oh gosh, these leftists are probably puritanicals and moralists. And if you don't fit into a perfect box, and GCAS doesn't fit into the perfect left-wing box. And therefore, I've seen it all. So I was kind of hesitant. And then I think eventually either I liked some of your stuff and vice versa. And then eventually we started talking, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Try to be inclusive. So maybe to finish it off, it would be good to know where people can learn more about GCAS and keep up with its developments. How can they apply to be a student? How they keep up with you?
Yeah, well, head to our website, I think, gcas.ie and GCAS.ie for Ireland. And you could check out videos, learn some stuff, look at our information on the about side of the website, and try out a course or two. I think you'll be, if you like a challenge and you like to start thinking, interestingly with different people, it's really quite something. So yeah, and then you can always drop us an email, myself or Ivana, or others in GCAS. So you can email us at contact@gcas.ie.
All right, cool. I can add those things to the show notes for people.
That'd be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time. Yeah, good luck with GCAS and growing it out.
Yeah, I really appreciate. I think what you do here is really great, and thanks so much for your questions. Let's keep collaborating and see where this goes.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks.